Hello, everybody. Welcome to Leadership and Culture in Healthcare podcast. I'm Matthew Wynn, the podcast host. And this week we're into the series 5 where we're talking about NHS organisations that are now in something called group models or mergers. And I'm delighted that I have Maria Kane. Maria, welcome to the podcast. Why don't you start by introducing yourself and then saying something about the organisations, because it's in plural, that you lead at the moment as well?
Okay. Hi, Matthew. Yeah, I'm Maria Kane. I'm Group Chief Executive these days, fairly recently, actually, appointed in August 24 of North Bristol Trust and University Hospitals Bristol and Weston, having been the Chief Executive at North Bristol Trust since April 21. I have been a Chief Executive in the NHS for about 17 years now, starting off with mental health in North London, plus community services, and most recently in London, moving to the North Middlesex Hospital in Tottenham, in a fairly deprived part of North London. And then, of course, COVID, moved to Bristol in the middle of that, and was very lucky to see firsthand, actually, 2 trusts across a city, including Weston now, that had been part of a more recent merger with University Hospitals Bristol, really, I suppose the phrase is better together. So COVID made things a lot more permeable between us. We recognised the need to do things together, to share resources, to perhaps reduce some of the barriers and misconceptions that we had about one another. Realised that as people and colleagues, none of us had 2 heads, that we were all trying to do the right thing by patients. And so we set up some really good relationship building through adversity. But what it did propel us towards was the idea that actually there were lots of services that we were providing that were, I'd use the word fragile. And by that I mean didn't always have the best outcomes for patients, or certainly had very variable outcomes depending on which trust you attended, and therefore something of a postcode lottery. We noticed that some services, we had problems where we were competing for staff, we were competing for resources, we were competing for investment in technology, in capital, not always for the good of patients. We also recognise that we're in a system where we spend a lot of money on people being ill rather than keeping people well. And that was a conversation, certainly as part of our integrated care system, that we felt was worth exploring in more detail, about how could we anticipate care so that people didn't actually end up having to be in a very high cost environment to receive care once they were ill. So there were a number of different factors. It had been talked about across Bristol for many, many, many years. And it was interesting about why things haven't happened in the past. And actually, often we've had really good ideas in the NHS, but the energy to take them forward before the next crisis hits us, or the next winter hits us, or something comes out that we have to respond to very quickly, meant that we hadn't necessarily put time and energy into it on a sustained basis. So we committed at that point, having really made some good relationships through COVID, through University Hospital Bristol having merged with Weston and all the learning that there had been from that. We committed to try to come together and do a piece of work which we ended up calling the Joint Clinical Strategy. And it was that piece of work that has propelled us, mainly because our clinicians asked us to move in this way, to look at, if we're going to provide services that are equitable, that are sustainable, that move resources around the system over time in a managed way, and that offer value to the public purse, deduplicate, help us do the right thing first time, then we probably need to come at this from an angle about single accountability and having a single oversight about how we do things once. And so this began to enshrine a principle of a group model, which both of the trust boards signed off, I think, back in December 23. So we have spent the last year really getting to grips with what that might look like. So based on a single shared joint clinical strategy, making an appointment of a joint chair, and more recently me as the chief executive. I have recently appointed 2 hospital managing directors, one for North Bristol Trust, one for UHBW. They will have local site operating unit leadership responsibility. And I am in a position of, whilst being the accountable officer, I really want to magnify that local leadership and make sure that there is the right level of autonomy, decision-making, risk-taking in a managed way that is done across all of our sites.
Yeah. Just before we dive into, therefore, how it might operate, I'm fascinated how these things emerge. So you've just described what sounded like a very simple, well-articulated plan set of stuff had been going on in the past. The pandemic brought us closer together. We then started to kind of really say, let's do things differently. And then we're here. It must have been tougher than that. I mean, how do you move from, say, let's say, I don't know, 22, 23, because you signed off your both boards approaches in December 23. I imagine that means most of 2023 and the tail end of 22, you must have been grappling with the end of the pandemic. And then how did it end up with 2 chairs, 2 boards, 2 chief executives? You moved to something different. What was different at that point?
I think the work that had started on the clinical strategy, it was the enthusiasm and willingness of our clinicians, actually. Yes, we all agreed we needed to create some space, some room, get some support in for people to start thinking a little bit differently. I think giving some permission to think differently, looking at a number of factors around successful outcomes for patients, looking at the data, hearing some of the reasons why the trusts with their different histories also had lots in common. And I think this was one of the factors, Matthew. This wasn't one of these groups that comes about because it's a takeover of failure, or it's a very small trust being engulfed, or as some people might say, asset stripped. This was about 2 very proud trusts with their histories, and I will be brutally honest, their ups and downs, having got to a place of similar relative merit, enough differentiation actually to still warrant very much their own personalities, but serving a very finite population across Bristol and Weston, where many of the people actually have worked together, kids go to the same school, know each other, so lots of really positive factors, and people have worked between the trusts in many cases too. So it just felt like that the conditions were fairly ripe. And I would say that the COVID aspect, the need for us to, I suppose, look at all these left shifting things that we're being asked to do at the moment, analog to digital, doing things once. And actually some of that came about with the appointment of a joint chief digital information officer, which was even before going into the chair and chief executive role, and understanding that we can't really go very far while we're working on completely different information systems. So that was our first commitment about what are the things that we could and should do only once to allow our clinicians to work in a much more effective way.
That sounds very coherent, because to me that there's a mixture there of natural alignment, energy coming to the jointness, and I think you use that phrase of focusing on the commonality rather than the differences of our organizations or your organizations, and then presumably taking the opportunistic elements of digital leadership. I assume your role as joint chief exec was when one of the other chief execs left as well, because
there'd been an interim. So previous chief executive had left and there was an interim, had worked really well with actually both previous chief executives. And there had been a stated commitment that moving to a group model was the right thing to do. So there had been, I believe, some very good leadership at chair, chief exec and executive team level across both of the trusts. So actually putting a lot of self-interest to one side, really looking at it from our 4 Ps lens. So P as in our patients, our people, our population, and public purse. Some of which will be enabled by a 5th P, the partnerships we have. But I think, coming together and really seeing for a sustainable future, if we take ourselves out of the equation, what is the best thing? What's the best configuration to enable this clinical strategy being delivered? And the group model was pretty much where we universally came to as a conclusion. Which is easily said, Matthew.
Yeah.
You say group, and then the hard work starts. This is that beginning of the end and end of the beginning, actually, as we start with these appointments and what a structure might look like.
We'll get into what your group actually looks like in a second, because they're all very different. And part of this podcast is about understanding, what it's like to lead in that arrangement. But just before we get there, you just used a wonderful phrase of putting self-interest aside. And I'm assuming that's personal as well as organizational at that point. Was it hard, though, to get your boards, and your boards being a mixture of executive and non-executive, to get to the point where they all put self-organizations aside and say, no, there is something better together here? Because, from my personal experience and also from what we know in the NHS, that's often quite a hard thing to do. People are wedded to organizations rather than what the organizations actually do.
Absolutely. And as human beings, we're brought up to crave boundaries, aren't we? Are you in my gang? I've got complete allegiance to mine, so yours must be horrible. We have all these patterns and mechanisms, and of course that will be true even when we're grown-up humans too. But actually we did something back in, I hadn't been here very long, but invited the 2 trusts to come together, the 2 boards, to talk about our shared challenges, with an expectation that both trusts write on 2 separate boards, whilst not looking what our top 5 challenges were. You won't be surprised, Matthew, to hear that when we both turned round, it was exactly the same list. So it was back to the better together phrase, trying to tackle these things once. And there were things like no criteria to reside, some of the clinical outcomes, capital expenditure in a world where capital is very constrained. That they were our top 5 challenges, and we decided we wanted to do them together. The other factor actually was that we both, and it was a methodology that I'd used in a previous trust, continuous improvement methodology called Patient First, based on, Kaizen principles. Most of them are kind of leaning in nature. But both trusts decided to adopt patient first as our continuous improvement methodology. So we have a single improvement language, a single way of improving and learning from each other and adopting practice very quickly. And between two organisations, that has been incredibly powerful thing to do. And we are working on very similar sets of priorities. So we've all got a triangle, haven't we, in NHS organisations these days? We can pretty much map our objectives, values, improvement priorities onto each other's triangles now. And that, we could have done that without being a group in some ways, but the commitment to a group was, I think, that little energy boost, and also told our teams and our clinicians, actually, we've pushed this big old boulder up the hill. It's taken a very long time, decades actually. We are not going to lose momentum now. This is going to go and roll and go in the right direction. And I think it has, and that tilt over the top has really energized people. We've gone on to secure a strategic partner to work with us, a partner which is a range of skills that comes together to match what it is we need going forward, and who can also help us, I suppose, jump over those areas where others have made mistakes so we don't have to make them. We're quite capable of making our own mistakes and learning from those. But it was really important to get some really good communications, some quick wins, to get those skills gaps that we would need for a short amount of time in place to propel us forward. And so I think clinical strategy, strategic partner, willingness of boards, and the clinical push have been the real, I suppose, success factors. And I say success factors talking at a very early stage. The other thing I would suggest that may be a little bit different to some others is that we are going to have a formal evaluation done of this group model. So when people say, but there's no evidence for a group model working, they're absolutely right, because a group means so many different things. So, measuring apples against pears. Some groups are set in train for very different reasons, either clinical failure, financial sustainability. We've got a mixture, as I mentioned, the 4 Ps. So our evaluation, which we're having done independently, will look at a small number of metrics attached to each of those Ps. Is it better for patients in terms of access and outcomes? Is it better for our people in terms of retention rates, access to training, etc.? What's our staff survey going to tell us as we track it over time? Are we able in time to move money around the system to keep more people out of hospital? And I suppose as a demonstration of that, we can invest more as a system in primary, community and social care. And then lastly, a public purse in deduplicating, in doing things once, in avoiding waste, in being more efficient. Can we actually save some money? I won't use the P word, productivity. I think that's become a little bit of a soiled brand, because actually I think clinicians hear that and their heart sinks, because it feels like we are running harder, faster, longer on the hamster wheel, and no one is very keen to do that at the moment. So we talk much more about the positives of doing it right first time, of avoiding those things that make absolutely no sense to you because they don't add any value and they're just irritating. And then, of course, use of technology, AI, things that we can insert that take out some of the very, very routine and less interesting tasks, so we retain interest and curiosity and keep improving.
And it would be fascinating to see your evaluation when it's done, because I'm sure you're right. There's not much written yet on the effectiveness of group models, but listening to you, you've already described what I would argue are the core requirements of a culturally good organization, full stop. So there's engagement, there's transparency, there's a clinically led strategy, and then you've worked on the positives of what you are doing together. And then you very beautifully, rapidly said, and we've aligned objectives, plans, and values. If all organizations align their objectives, plans, and values and have it under a clinical strategy, I think we'd be in a better position in the NHS full stop, wouldn't we? Whether in a group or in an individual organization. So to me, sounds like you've got most of the ingredients pretty much there, Maria, in terms of what you're doing. And I guess you've had to work really hard at those fundamentals and make sure they happen.
So we've done a lot around senior leadership. There's always that, I suppose, balance of there are now 28,000 staff. 28,000 staff are not going to be affected by this. Perhaps a very small proportion will be. But of course, these things provoke anxiety. So what we try to do is have a lot of face-to-face. As the chief exec of 28,000 people, there's no way I can be visible. I cannot, unless I send myself out as an avatar and clone. I'm looking at multi-channel communications, but also senior teams delivering these messages face to face. So we're trying to work out how we bring people together. We've had shared senior leadership team meetings, strategy away days, lots of opportunities for the teams to come together. But the most energizing of these have been the joint clinical strategy steering groups, where we have lots of people from across our divisions in a room. And actually the energy from those meetings is palpable. And the ideas and seeing how motivated people are to want to think differently is really heartening. I would also say, Matthew, I feel very lucky and very privileged with the caliber of the teams I have around me. And also, if I look at the improvement trajectories of both organisations, and that I would look firstly at the staff survey, I would look at patient outcomes, I would look at CQC reports, but I'd also look at how I feel when I go in and some of the tangible positivity and the hope and the optimism and the openness to new ideas. I think the fact that we're one of the highest funded research environments in Bristol, that level of innovation and wanting to know more and find out. So I've got a lot of the good ingredients. They were already there on the shelf. There'll be an alchemy about how much of each you put in and might stir the pot and it's not quite gelling and we might have to try a few times. But that's that continuous improvement methodology of we will learn from where things aren't working and go back into the improvement cycle.
Mm-hmm. And I think, my father lives in Bristol. I have sat in your hospital quite a few times. And the last time that happened in the tail end of last year, a superb service in your medical admission unit, really engaged staff, clearly, really focused on the right things for patients. Actually, I would say probably a lot better than last time he was in. And so, that impact that you described is clearly making a difference to all the staff. I'm not as stupid as you are to think that won't change day by day for pressures, but it's a big ask. And on that then, you described you are the accountable officer, you have your managing directors for sites, and you have a great leadership teams and clinical leaders, no doubt, throughout all of your kind of divisional areas, etc. And one of the things people do, I think, fire criticism, probably unjustly at the moment, at group models is that thing of, well, Maria, how can you make a difference to 28,000 staff, £2 billion worth of expenditure across, Bristol's 500,000 people down to Weston, South Gloucestershire? How do you make a difference, and how does your board, your chair, know that actually they can be accountable for something of what's in your mind as the ultimate leader on those things?
So it's a very different job, actually, to having been the chief executive of one organization. Lifting yourself clear in some ways so that the difference you made, that there has to be an impartiality, with the primary focus being back, as I told you earlier, on these 4 Ps and decisions made in line with that, and taking away some of the previous and vested interests that may have influenced decisions. I would have to say, a couple of factors in there. 2 sets of non-executives who are often recruited to be aligned to a single organization, taking this brave decision to say, actually, we are now going to prioritize in line with the needs of the totality of our system. And I've seen that actively happen when we looked at our capital prioritization. We decided that one trust needs, for historical reasons, were far higher than the other, and therefore decisions were taken in line with bringing Trust A, which shall remain nameless, up to a particular standard. Similarly with digital investment, there was a disparity, but for us to move forward together, both trusts need to be really working at the same level with the same investment in infrastructure. And so I would show that as perhaps an example of where that leadership can make a real difference that you wouldn't necessarily take if you were 2 separate organizations. And again, the support from previous chairs, and now our joint chair, Ingrid Barker, has been absolutely key in getting us to a point where people are saying, no, I understand that. We often feel we're there to do absolutely right by the people around us in the building in which we sit. So to have this new mindset, the culture change that needs to go with it, the headset that we're now working with, that has been probably the biggest part of my role over the last year and will continue to be for, I'm sure, the next few years to come.
Mm. And so just to help people understand how this large group operates, are you having separate trust boards, or are you onto a joint board? And then how are decisions discharged or delegated through to, so you can keep the focus on the major outcomes, those 4 Ps, but you can empower people to get on and do the detail of the things as well? How give people a flavour of how that kind of is, how that's looking?
Okay. It's a complicated picture, Matthew. I can tell you NHS governance can be an arcane set of processes. And of course, UHBW is a foundation trust and a merged foundation trust with its governors and constitution, etc. North Bristol Trust is an NHS trust. There are some differences, although they are decreasing in terms of financial freedoms and flexibilities, but also perhaps historically how people went about what they prized in terms of, EBITDAs and surpluses, and so there are different languages actually as we come together. But with our 4P focus, that has been easy to move forward. At the moment, we are still 2 separate boards. We're not a merged organisation, and sometimes the question is asked, why didn't you merge? Actually, at the time, but as everything, we keep all of these things under review, and as we go through our various evaluations over the years, we will keep under review as well. The transaction, the expense, the energy that was going to be needed to do something like that was felt that we weren't at that point. But where we were was to look at that willingness to start trying things out together. And so the group structure has come about from that, an acute provider collaborative that has moved into now a group where we've got our clinical services, our support services, and our corporate services all being looked at in a kind of single way. And then asking your point about the boards, currently 2 separate boards of the 2 organisations, but from the 1st of April, we are going to move to a board meeting in common. So without the move to a merged transaction and a single entity, we will retain the 2 boards, but it will meet as a board in common. And we will really need to look at that, because currently we're about 30 members of that board, which is unwieldy. So that will be the next stage of thinking.
Yeah. And I think that's going to be the interesting development that will have to be tested out, is how without merging organizations, how does one undertake great governance to give accountability, to give assurance that everything's okay, but at the same time, really importantly, reducing cost and keeping simplicity as well. And there's some, as you and I both know, there's some real tensions within just that statement, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other factor is, has the regulatory regime moved along with the group model? Or are we still very focused on single institutions, buildings, auditors, etc.? Often our regulators are very much looking through that single lens and single accountability line, as opposed to what would this look like across a group? How do you easily move money? How do you easily reinvest or deprioritize capital? We are doing that, and we are talking about a single acute provider voice and response to our population need. But actually some of that is getting around regulatory boundaries rather than being enabled to as easily as we would like.
Yeah. And let's then focus on you, Maria, which you may not do. No chief exec that I've had on this podcast relishes talking about themselves. It's always easier to talk about one's team, isn't it? But you've said it means I've got to be a different type of leader. I think that's what you said as the group chief exec. Talk us a little bit more about that. What does it mean your job is? How do you lead, and how do you keep this enormous group efforts on track? Because ultimately the accountability does wrap up to you, doesn't it? You are the accountable officer for both.
Yeah, and that can be an uncomfortable position to be in, holding all accountability, but having to cede a lot of control. And be much more reliant on data and working through other people. And I perhaps haven't appreciated, my intrinsic motivation has always been about being with people and having good connections and relationships and good understanding, and seeing things change and being part of the change. And actually my role now takes me away from some of that. I love walking up the corridor and saying hello to Mr. Brown and hello to Dave from Estates and whoever. Actually, with 28,000 people, there is not the possibility of me being able to do that in a meaningful way. Although, of course, visible engagement is very high on my own need as well as an organisation need. So actually, trying to do some work with myself actually about my expectations and how my motivation will remain and increase as I move into what I do absolutely feel will be better in the long run, and having this kind of change that needs to go on with me, where the impacts I'm seeing are not going to be immediate in the same way. The connection is not immediate in the same way. And I'm working with 2 teams that I'm trying to build together two existing teams, an embarrassment of riches actually across these two teams, and really assessing, as I get to know them, the strengths and then some of the challenges, as we are all expected to work in a different way.
Mm. And just, I think you mentioned data, use of data, focus on the 4 Ps and therefore quantification of the outcomes of what you're achieving. So those are two kind of, I wouldn't say they're different things, but they're clear focus of you as the group chief exec. What are the skills or potential kind of weapons in your armory, if that's not an unhelpful phrase, are you having to take on to be a group chief exec that is different to being a uni-organizational accountability?
I think it's the being very non-partisan, really having to look collectively. I suppose sitting in the position of privilege whereby you can see both sides, but ultimately some quite difficult decisions may need to be made and held to and all out managed. So I suppose there's more of an arbiter role in some respects, but there's also a narrator role, making the public understanding of what we're doing and why very clear. Lots of political interest in group models, but also working with our partners. You know, people's first question is whether they voice it or not, what's in it for me? So what else can we do for our system and our system partners? What can we do for our patients and our staff? So making sure that my communication is addressing those, so people feel that there is going to be something in it for them. There will be. Things may come out at different times, but just trying to, I suppose, spread that hope and optimism whilst getting a little bit of time to go away and actually do the job and get things in place. So trying to get that balance, win confidence, and keep people informed, but with a humility that probably not everything is going to go well and smoothly, and there will be a few blips in the road. Otherwise, we would have done this a long, long time ago.
Yeah. Maria, I could talk to you for hours, but I know time's pressing, and maybe some reflection, a final reflection from you then on those that are starting their leadership journey. I this week had a conversation with the facilitator of the next chief exec course. That's not what we're calling it, but the aspiring chief exec course. And I was having this conversation about there are going to be less chief exec roles around because in the NHS, I mean, just take your group, you would have had historically 3 chief execs, wouldn't they, for Weston, for University Hospital Bristol, and for North Bristol Trust? That would have been 3. Now it's 1. So, and you've just described, I think, a really interesting mix of different dynamics that you're having to operate with across that group that is maybe different to the uni organizational chief exec role that others will know. So as people start on their leadership journey and are thinking about these roles for the future, what's your reflections? What's your, I won't say advice, but what would you be pointing people to do to think about as they develop what's important? Because I guess I just finally the lens of, I don't think this is going to change. I think what you're describing and what is happening around the place, hence this podcast series, is going to be our reality. It's going to be prevalent everywhere. And therefore, we need to be training leaders to operate in this way.
You're absolutely right. And I think the duty to cooperate, collaborate, etc., has also been strengthened in the 10-year plan and its commitment. So I think you're right. We're absolutely going in that direction on an ongoing basis. So roles like hospital managing director, people need to know what that role is. How does that get supported? It's a really difficult role because actually regional meetings, national meetings, people are asking for chief execs to be there. Actually, we need hospital managing directors there as well, so they feel connected. they are supported, they are able to develop, but there is still a clear accountable officer that sits within that, so they're allowed to do their learning during that time. And I don't think that's a role that is fully fleshed out yet. There'll also be, I suppose, we need better understanding so that people who are now reporting to a hospital managing director rather than a chief executive don't feel in any way diminished. They're not. They're doing exactly the same job as they were X weeks ago, if that situation changes. But people can't help but perhaps feel that there is a change somehow. Going forward, I think, my advice, such as it could be, everyone is so different. I made, a promise to myself before I even went for my first chief executive role 17 years ago, that I would never take a decision that was just about keeping me in the job. And it's a real freedom, actually, to have made that commitment to myself, because I can and have had to go back to that several times in my career, but kind of knowing where your red line is, I think, is really important. The other two C, well, perhaps three C's: courage, curiosity, and continuous improvement. So being courageous, which is finding the energy, keeping hope and optimism, and that is sometimes courageous when it's very easy to fall into this, isn't it awful, type pit of despair. I really think that is an essential characteristic of future leaders. I don't mean Pollyanna, but I do mean, my goodness, aren't we lucky to be able to do what we're doing? And I have said this in many platforms before, but imagining that every conversation I have at work, I'm doing with a patient sitting behind me listening to it. That really does change the tone of a conversation sometimes. The curiosity bit is, let us not habituate too quickly. We suddenly stop seeing things and asking ourselves why we're doing them. It happens so quickly. So put in place some either people around you who will keep asking you and digging at these questions. And that might mean getting injection of new people on a regular basis. Why are you doing things like that? Or where we've come from. So keep that relativity and that inquiring mind for as long as you can. And if you feel you're habituating, and that's generally when things feel too comfortable, ask someone else to come in and have a look. And then the continuous improvement bit, this is back to intrinsic motivation, our ABC of, do we have autonomy? Can we really feel that we're doing a job in the way we would like to do it, and we have some flexibility? Do we feel we have a sense of belonging? We're part of a team, we know who we would go to, and see, are we valued for our contribution? So if we feel yes to those, we probably feel safe. We probably want to just not do our job, but really improve our job and be valued for doing it. I think that really, ticks our little button. It certainly ticks mine about, wow, I'm getting a bit better. I can see I've got a bit better from where I was last time. So I suppose these checks and balances that we might want to inbuild into ourselves. At this level, there aren't many people you can go to ask for help. No one comes up to me and goes, hi, you've been chief exec for ages now. You've got to go through do a chief exec course all over again. Should I have to? Possibly I should. If I look at what my clinical colleagues have to do, perhaps we should be professionalised more as leaders and managers with a really good accredited system. And I know that is actively being investigated at the moment. And I'd be very supportive of that, as long as it's at the developmental end of things rather than the punitive pass-fail type end as well.
Well, that's a whole new podcast just on that topic, Maria, I think, which is going to be fascinating. Maria, you've been very gracious with your time. It's been really interesting to listen about how the ingredients in Bristol and Gloucestershire and Weston have come together, that you have got a joint clinical strategy, you've aligned your interests, you've got boards operating together, you are developing joint approaches to how you do things. You've described really eloquently about, therefore, what's the role of the group chief executive, what skills you are bringing to that approach. And I think underlying amongst all of that is some interesting challenges of how you do things smarter, how we can make the group model work, how the regulatory world needs to keep up with kind of making, I think, important decisions for the benefit of patients, which clearly are going to be right. And therefore, just the mechanics need to align to that rather than us align ourselves to the mechanics and miss the patient out in there. And you've just been describing really wonderfully about how, need courage, curiosity, continued improvement to really drive leadership forward. And any future leader or people studying or grappling with leadership could well learn quite a lot just from you've been describing about your inquiring mind. And not habituating into certain approaches. Maria, thank you. I wish you all success in what you're doing. You've clearly got some big things coming up for April as well in terms of the joint approach. Good luck in a joint board. And thank you for all you're doing and for joining us on Leadership and Culture in Healthcare.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you, Matthew.